Good morning, and thank you for joining me for the fifth of our 5-part series about human trafficking. We spent the first 4 parts of this series talking about some of the myths that surround the issue of human trafficking. And as I prepared for this 5th part to focus on the demand, I really feel like we need to just start a whole new series. So I'm going to just use today's time to introduce one piece of the demand issue. But I think the next couple of weeks I'm going to continue with this subject because it's one that doesn't get enough attention in my opinion, but it's also really maybe the most difficult part of this discussion because it's going to require us as a culture. It's going to require you as an individual to really reflect and to think about what you might be doing or what the people in your life might be doing that could be contributing to the continuation of human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. So if you've watched the previous videos, just to recap, we've learned a little bit about the lack of discrimination in this industry. It doesn't matter what color your skin is or how old you are or what community you grew up in or what your socioeconomic status is. Risk to be trafficked crosses all of those circumstances, all of those variables. There are people who are more vulnerable to traffickers, and because traffickers are so manipulative and coercive, they pay very close attention and they find intentionally the people who have vulnerabilities because it makes it easier for them to force them into the trafficking situation. We've talked about how this is happening in Grand Rapids, right under our noses and in hidden places. And so today, as we start to look at the demand piece, I want to just ask you, just take a deep breath with me and be willing to watch this entire video and consider what you can be doing differently or how you can hold accountability and love to the people in your life. As I spent time kind of praying about this issue, because that's just how I operate, that's what I do before I enter into something, before I communicate publicly about something, I really want to make sure that what I'm saying is aligned with God's heart on the issue. And I was praying and I said, I feel like I need an example of something. I need like a character in the Bible that people can connect to and reference that person's story on their own and let this message sink in a little bit beyond just these couple minutes. And I felt like the Lord brought me to the story of David, which is interesting because I've read it many, many times, and so I know the story of David, but it didn't come on my own. And immediately I knew he was talking about David and Bathsheba. And so I just want to quickly take you through that story because it represents the heart of man still today. Now, David was elevated in his worldly position by the Lord because he loved God. He wanted to serve God. He truly was seeking to honor God in how he led his people. But David was human. He was flesh like you and I are. And because God didn't make robots, we have to learn in life how to either honor him in every circumstance that is presented to us. And sometimes we learn that by failing, right? Sometimes we learn that by first choosing the opposite. And David's no different. Although David had this royal authority over God's people, he still was human. He still made mistakes. And so one day he's walking on his balcony and he sees Bathsheba naked in her bath. And he lusts for her. So he sees her and he is tempted and he asks about her. And his people tell him, oh yes, this is who she is. She's married. But David ignores that because the lust temptation within him is driving his decision making, and so he calls for her. And she comes to his palace, and he takes her to bed. Well, her husband is fighting in battle. He's not anywhere around, and soon after that, she realizes that she's pregnant. And so David, looking at his sin behavior and what he did, and knowing that it wasn't right, he decides he's going to try and cover it up. So he calls for her husband to come out of battle, and he brings him to the palace, and he encourages him to go home and spend the night with his wife. But her husband, out of respect for the men who are still fighting that night, chooses not to do that, and instead he sleeps in front of the palace gate. And David learns about that the next day, and he decides he needs to up it a little bit. And so he brings him in again the next night, and he feeds him, and he gives him alcohol and makes him drunk, and then tries to persuade him to go home to his wife so that they can make love and it can cover David's sin. But her husband, again, out of respect for the men who are in battle, says no, and he sleeps again at the gate of the palace. And so David, in his desperation to cover what he's done, he takes it another step further, and he actually goes to the leader of the part of the military that her husband is in and says, put him on the front lines and then draw back so that the enemy can kill him. So David orchestrates the murder of her husband in order to cover his tracks. He's gone from just seeing a beautiful woman and lusting after her to engaging in adulterous sex with her, to now trying to kill her husband. He didn't just wake up that day and decide he was going to kill her husband. He first lusted, and he gave way to that lust, and he engaged in relationships with Bathsheba, and then he gave way to the consequences of his actions and further engaged even deeper sin by pursuing the murder of her husband to cover his tracks. Well, none of the people around David knew this full story probably, but the Father knew. God knew. And he was displeased with what David was doing. And so David had to deal with that. David had consequences in the world, but he also had consequences with the Father. Now, the Father never condemned him. He loved him all the way through it. He took him through every single step, and he was there with him. But David had to surrender the things that he had done. He had to repent those things, and he had to be restored to the Father. Sin for us is no different. People don't wake up one day and decide that they're going to sexually and physically abuse a woman or a child on the street, and that's the first entryway into it. They first see a woman and lust for her. They then justify and excuse that lust to move into the next level of that behavior. And if they get away with it and it feels good temporarily, they continue to justify and manipulate those things for that behavior, and they move into the next. And so is true for people who contribute to the demand of human trafficking. They don't just wake up one day and decide, today I'm going to go rape somebody and pay money to do it. They move through a path of sinful behavior that justifies and manipulates and convinces them that what they're doing is okay. And so as a culture, as a people, as God-fearing women, because men are largely the contributors to this, we must hold our men accountable in love. Ladies, take hold of this week. Let it bless you and encourage you, and dive into that story and let God speak to your heart. And we'll do it again next Friday. And we'll focus a little bit more on some other areas of human trafficking demand. Thank you.